Well, I'm sort of overwhelmed. I think everybody is. So I'm curious about something. Can everybody hear
Can
me?
you hear me?
Um, do you, I think one of the things that makes this collaboration and the contentiousness of it to some degree is because this is so very, very personal for Maurice and not as personal for everyone else.
Interesting.
And I really think that is at the heart of this in many ways. So I'm curious, do you have a personal connection to the story of the Holocaust?
Well, can you hear me? Is this on? Yeah. I do. I don't. My family, the people who were destroyed, and there certainly were people I was not aware of. So I don't have individuals in my family who were victims. I do have individuals in my family who wound up in Israel and, sort of founders and so on because of the Holocaust, but not in the same way that Maurice is talking about.
Well, I actually do. So I had a very powerful connection to this piece, and I understood completely where he was coming from. And I'm just very I mean, first of all, what an amazing film. I mean, incredible.
Thank you all very much.
Incredible. And I know how hard it is. I've never actually made a film like this because I wouldn't be as good at it as you are.
Oh.
But I know how hard it is to make a film like this. So let's kind of go back to how did this come about and your connection to this and their allowing you into this sacred space of the creative process, which is really hard to get anybody to do.
Yeah, I mean, looking back on it, sometimes I can't imagine that people who were, in a way, less sure of themselves would have allowed this to happen. The genesis of it was I was finishing a different film, totally different film, and I had a summer intern, lovely young woman who said at the end of the summer, gee, my uncle Michael's going to be in town with his dance company, Palopolis, and maybe you and Richard, my husband, would like to come see them. And I said, oh, God, I haven't seen them in years, and I love them, and went to their performance and went back to thank him. And I said, what are you guys working on next? And he said, well, we're doing this collaboration with Maurice Sendak, kind of a dark, almost like a Grimm's fairy tale, sort of Holocaust thing we're thinking about. And I said, that sounds like a movie. And you should never say those words unless you're fully prepared to then spend several years delivering on it. So that was the genesis of it. So I met all of them, and I met Maurice and Arthur, and I showed them some of my other work, and they, I was more or less contemporaries with the founders of Palopolis, and we were in the same mindset in that kind of working in the moment way, and with Maurice, I just adored him. And so they let me in, but it then meant a huge commitment, as you can see, of having to be there all the time.
So let's talk a little bit about that process. First of all, how long was the whole thing from beginning to end?
Well, we were shooting for on and off, not all the time, because they worked on other dances. Palopolis, I think still, but certainly, and I worked with them a number of times after this. I made other films with them. They they actually embraced this, and we worked together. They had to produce 5 or 6, new dances every year. So when they were working on this, I was there, and it was a piece that was actually put up once and then reworked and put up again. So we were shooting over almost 2 years on and off. Yep.
And how large was your crew?
Except during performance days and certain 1 or 2 days in the studio when, for instance, when we had Bob Bilecki doing sound, or we had, other people working with the company, It was me and Vic and a sound person. So that's part of the reason we got the kind of material we got. And so many of you in this room are filmmakers, or you're certainly, one of the most film sophisticated audiences in the world. So there's no such thing as fly on the wall filmmaking. That's, not what happens. But what does happen is you're around long enough and you simply become part of whatever that dynamic is. And so ultimately, because I never let anyone see a frame of footage other than some of the pure, just dance rehearsal stuff for their own purposes. Oh, I'm sorry. When they were scoring or trying to work out musical cuts and beats and that sort of thing, they had some of that footage, but they never saw anything else. And so they had to trust me. And over a period of time, I guess because they saw our commitment along with theirs, they did.
Well, it's a very fine line that you had to, play in that. You must, I think, emotionally immerse yourself in what's going on. At the same time, you don't want to intrude on what's happening, and you have to maintain some objectivity. That must have been hard. I mean, whose side were you on? I mean, I would have been like, leave him alone.
Yeah, well, the truth is, I had you ask about the Holocaust side of it. I was very much an advocate for that story being allowed to unfold however it was going to. And you had asked me about the crew. So it was 3 of us on the dance floor, as you see, or with the ADs. And it kind of worked because we worked with a handheld camera with a small monitor on it, and I could see what was going on. I was often guiding Vic, actually with him physically, literally in touch with him, so that he could cover what he was covering, but so that I could anticipate what he couldn't see. Or sometimes it would be a sound man who was picking up what was happening. So we sometimes would be the people they turn to, and they'd say, well, what do you think? So that question of maintaining objectivity, in a way, you've got to be honest, you've got to be truthful. And it did shift, or it did change, but you have to be an honest broker when you're in that situation. Otherwise, people stop trusting you.
So many questions. The music in this film is extraordinary. How much of it is from the opera that was written by
Krause?
Yeah, how much of it is it?
A good deal of the music. I made a mental connection for myself, which was that all of the music in the film had to be string quartet music. That's what Krause wrote from Middle Europe, from that period. So there's some Janacek, there's a little bit of Nino Rota, who was actually recording it around that time. But pretty much everything else is from 4 of the composers who are at Terezin. So what you're hearing is string quartet music, much of it some of it composed while they were interned and before all of them were murdered. They were all murdered at Auschwitz. So that's what you're hearing. You're hearing the music they composed either right before or during the time that they were in this camp, which was a period of about 2 years.
I really love how you use the footage of the Nazi propaganda film. Isn't that an extraordinary story? I mean, I know a lot about that, and it's amazing to me how they got away with this, and that for a long time. I mean, the Red Cross, all kinds of people went there to see what was going on and make sure that there was nothing, there was no humanity abuse going on. And I don't know how they pulled it off, but I mean, were the buildings actually real? I mean, or were they just sort of storefronts or what?
I've been to Terezin since, and some of those buildings, many of them actually, are still standing. So they don't look quite like the shacks, the tin roof shacks that you see in some of the other camps, but what there were tunnels and trenches dug underneath and around, and ways for the Nazis to take people to the killing fields where they were going to kill them. Some people were shot there. Many people died of disease and malnutrition. So if you simply looked at it, you'd see what might look like an old village, parts of it, not all of it. But what it was bulwarked with were walls and ditches and cellars and holding rooms and that sort of thing that were part of any concentration camp from that period.
The footage of the children it kind of gets you every time. And Maurice's connection to that I thought was so interesting, to say, you know, I'm alive and they aren't.
Yeah.
And I can never let go of this story. Why do you think there was so much resistance? I mean, I know it's right brain, left brain stuff going on there all the time through this whole thing, which I found fascinating. But why was there so much resistance on the part of which one? I can't remember, the curly-haired guy.
Jonathan Walker.
To actually owning the story.
It's very interesting because he was the European Jew in the group of artistic directors. He was the only one. He had his own issues about fathers and about history. And he had always played the role of devil's advocate in that group. And I think he had never come up against anyone quite like Maurice. And I think there was something very Oedipal going on there between them. And it was both mythic but also very natural somehow that it played out the way it did between them, I think.
Well, ultimately, it's quite heartwarming.
They loved each other.
Yeah, you can see that. But I think Maurice says it in a way. The real heroes of this movie are the dancers. I mean, they are not only are they just physically amazing people, but they really got it. They understood what was going on there. I mean, that must have been extraordinary to watch.
It was astounding, and they would hold so much, sometimes over weeks and months. And based on what the dynamic was, they would bring back something that perhaps everyone else had forgotten months ago, you know, during the early improvisations. Some sense memory, some muscle memory that felt right, you know, to bring into what was happening in the present. And of course, their physical courage and tenacity and grace under pressure, you know, airborne, you know, genius in lifting something that was very sad, and sometimes, I don't know, you can't say illogical exactly, but purely emotional, and yet lifting it into a place where it has the narrative of a work of art. I don't know. That was the dancers. Yeah.
Well, they understood the story, and they found a way to express it. Was Maurice in awe of them, do you feel, in some way?
So smitten, so in awe. He worshipped them. And he fought and stayed on, I think, because of the dancers, because he didn't want to leave them. And I think it's there in what he says. It may be more subtext, but he kind of says it also, yeah.
Was there ever a point that you thought that this would be abandoned? That everybody would just get up and say, oh, forget about it?
Well, that's the other thing. I honestly and truly, as close as it came to completely imploding, you ask what it meant to have a film crew there all the time. Ultimately, I don't think anyone wanted the piece to fail on film. And I think that played a role.
Well, that's interesting.
I really think that.
It became the catalyst for success.
I think it had something to do with the fact that it didn't fall apart. The other thing was that one of the ways I mentioned earlier that I never showed anyone a frame of footage, but I knew how contentious, you all saw how contentious it was, as well as passionate, you know, engaged. And one of the ways I had to protect them and their agency and their authority in terms of the experience that they had had was, because this piece took so long to do, I was able to go back to them and ask them just to reflect on it. I gave them the room to say what they thought about the process, how they felt about it, what it meant to them. And they weren't restricted to simply having lived something they may have forgotten by then, but that they may have felt in some way badly about, or unfinished about. And so I gave them that complete license, to change their story if they wanted to. They always had that option.
How was your interaction? I mean, you were there for so much. You must have gotten to know the characters quite well, the dancers. And did you hang out? Did you go to dinner? Did you have drinks? How was that?
I spent a lot of time with the company, and saw a lot of them when they were in the city, and also spent quite a bit of time with Maurice. He and my husband and I and the people who lived with him at the time spent some time together. And then afterward, the film was shown a lot, and they were always ready to come and be there, when the film was shown. And I think for Maurice and for me, the thing that was so astounding and so unexpected and so valuable was that here was someone who people think of as a man who draws pictures, maybe writes stories, but is in some ways a stationary person. This was Maurice as a creator of performance. And I think it may be the only ballet he ever choreographed, him as a full-out performance artist. And it was the only thing he ever did of that kind. And I think that meant a great deal to him. I think he was proud of that.
Oh, he should be proud of it. I should be. I'm going to ask a technical. How you must have had incredible coverage. I mean, despite only one camera while you were shooting a lot. How long was the edit? Which is beautifully edited, by the way.
Thank you. I'm trying to remember now. I think we were probably editing for... Well, I was editing as we went along, obviously, because I needed to understand where things were going. And there were, maybe 200 hours of footage or something, maybe a little more. But once they finished the final performance and I had gone back to them again, for their reflections on it, I think maybe we were editing then after that for another 6 or 8 months, not much more than that, because then the film came out. So oddly enough, for me, that was not as long as maybe I would have spent now. I don't know. It was,
that's actually short for
Yeah.
I think for this kind of film. So the presence of Terry Teachout in this is very interesting. I don't know if you guys know who. I think he died, didn't he?
Terry died fairly recently. Brilliant.
He was brilliant.
Polymath. Just brilliant guy.
Man. He wrote about Leonard Bernstein almost as well as anybody I've ever read about. I mean, he's a great critic. But it's surprising that he was there during this whole process. I mean, how did that come about?
That came about because he was assigned. I can't remember if his piece, he certainly was published a number of times in the Wall Street Journal, which he wrote for, and the Washington Post. He was doing a feature piece on the company creating this work specifically, but also commenting on them, as he says, he thinks of them as a jazz group. I mean, he was a tremendous admirer of the company and had followed their work over time because of his love for jazz and because of what he saw as the connection of this kind of work with pure improvisation in music. And so he was around because he was writing about it. That's why he was there.
Was he there all the time or just some of the time?
No, he was there, I would say, for several of the rehearsals, but not all the time. He then, I'm sure, turned up like at some of the performances, but at that point, I didn't have the same access to him as I had when he was there in rehearsal, and he was very generous about, being a subject in the film.
So I just have one last question, and then others may have some. How was the risk? I mean, the most interesting thing is this collaboration and how you captured that process, that difficult creative process of just making something out of whole cloth. But what was the response finally to the final dance, the outcome of it? Was it positive? No, I don't mean the film. I know the film got a great response. I'm talking about the dance itself.
The critical
Selection.
response,
Yeah,
what reviewers said,
Yeah.
it was mixed. Some people were over the moon about it. For instance, the Times loved it. Some people didn't, and some people objected both to the nudity and to the, I would say, and this would also be true for some of the Jewish audiences that saw it, the liberties, if you will, that were taken with the factual horrors of the Holocaust. And I have a great interest in this, and I still do, and I may do something more with it. But the thing that Maurice drove was a kind of defiance of the atrocities, that the only way to meet that level of brutality and degradation and bestiality was with something that was equally ferocious and outrageous and vulgar, if you will, if it needed to be.
You have to draw blood.
You got to draw blood. You can take exception with that, and many people did, but that was their that was the way they embraced the subject. That's what they decided to do.
Well, if you're gonna, I don't think there's any other way to do it. But if you're going to approach the Holocaust, you can't do it with kid gloves. I mean, it is as awful as it's as awful as it gets. I think he was totally right. But I'm really surprised that there were that people objected to that part of it. Actually,
I think it was more. Well, I don't know. Actually, my recollection of it was that the reviews and the overall response to the piece was very, very positive. One reason they didn't continue touring it was that it was extremely expensive for them to do that piece. They refer to themselves as a Tyson Lights company. That's what they started out as. So the sets and all of the sound work and all of the prep work that they had to do for that piece became prohibitive for them as a widely touring company. Interestingly, I've been called by them just this last week, and they found the drop, and they're thinking about bringing the piece back into rep. So
wouldn't that be
we may have a
fabulous?
chance to look at this dance again.
Yeah, and well, your film should be really. By the way, the film was shortlisted for the Oscar, and as it well deserved. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask?
Yeah.
I don't know whether it's appropriate or you're willing to do it, but when you said, sorry, 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 oh, hi, that you did the process with the dancers, were you willing to share any of their comments or their thoughts?
You mean me personally after the film was made, or?
I thought you said you spoke to the dancers and that they debriefed on what the experience was like for them.
I did that with everyone. I did it with Maurice, Arthur, all three artistic directors, the dancers. I was an open channel because I was asking everything of them.
Right.
The one deal I had with them was that I could film whatever happened. And to their credit, they never said, turn the camera off.
That could be the post movie. Could you share just a little of?
Well, a lot of it's in the film. I mean, I think what people came away with was the dancers were fascinated by him. They had grown up as little kids reading his books, so, it was kind of a fairy tale for them to work with him at all. It's like the ogre, the genius ogre, walks into the room and says, be who you want to be. And I may kill you, but I'm going to make it fun, So I think their feelings about it were less mixed because for them it was all physicality. It was all just like doing it, like putting it out there. For the artistic directors, the stakes were higher. It was the company. It's their company. They're known for pure improvisation. Jonathan needed to have that power struggle. And Maurice was totally up for it,
Well, as he said, I think he really likes it.
Yeah.
Did you have any favorites, by the way, among the dancers? I mean, they all seem so wonderful, but Otis kind of really gets you, doesn't he?
Otis was remarkable, just remarkable. Well, I did a lot of filming with the company after this. I filmed a lot of the work of theirs at the Joyce. I did 2 other short films with them and a number of very short pieces. So I spent a lot of time with them. I think in terms of that mindset, the sort of pure, just go there, Otis and Matt were definitely among the great dancers from that company. Becca is astounding. She's the
The blonde.
the one with the tiny little swastikas on her dress. She's one of the great athletes ever, and doesn't strike you as someone who has, in a way, a real raw streak in her, but she does. So that's always fun when somebody who looks like a fairy princess, has that kind of edge. It's quite
This film's
wonderful.
about 20 years old now, right? So how old is it?
Yeah, the film came out, I think, in 2002, so
Yeah,
it's
so that's
just
about
20 years old.
So
yeah.
are those dancers still with Polobolas?
Matt Diaghilev, and the woman who came into Becca's role right after that, Becca left the company after that year. Her name is Renee Jaworski, and she's in the other films I did with Polobolas. They are now the artistic directors. So
Oh my!
they danced for many years after that, and they're now the artistic directors. But that company needs to sort of rejuvenate and change about every 5 to 8 years. That's more or less the amount of time people have that level of gymnastic physicality and just strength,
Oh,
to
absolutely.
do what they do.
Extraordinary.
But what happens is, as in many great cooperatives, they come back year after year with the dance in them to train, the next generation of people who are doing those dances. And some Polobolas members from the founding years, from Moses Pendleton and Martha Clark and Allison and these three guys, Michael, Robbie, and Jonathan, they still also come back sometimes and do training.
I knew Moses and I know Martha too.
Great
Anybody have any more questions? I know everybody's probably anxious to go to dinner, but
Hi.
They performed it many times, and they may be doing it again. They're thinking about bringing it back. Yeah.
I was curious about whether dance improvisations eventually are notated within the company, or is it all passed down sort of as an the
Well, that-
equivalent of an oral tradition? Is there any dance companies that are so improvisational use lab notation at some point or another?
It's a very good question, and the answer is no. So that's one reason why I gave them a lot of the footage that I had shot and why all their performances ultimately are filmed. So I filmed for them for 2 years at the Joyce, and I filmed everything, not just this, but other pieces, and that becomes part of their library of their work, all of which is donated to Dartmouth, which is where they all went to school and got together and started dancing. So anyone who wants to research Polobolas over the years, it's, as far as I know, accessible to the public, and that's how they do it. And that's why also it was important for me to be there for them, so they had a record of it.
any other questions?
Actually, I think it's Matt who says, I'm not really comfortable being naked. Did he reflect on that later at all? Was that, or did I misunderstand that in the film? It was a
He's
quick
very
moment.
comfortable being naked. It might have been when they were talking about the nudity. Is that what you mean? He said he didn't feel. You're right. He didn't feel good about the way it happened in that particular point in time in which they were working on it. He was also very susceptible to Jonathan's prompting.
Resistance to it.
Yeah, and he was very attached to Jonathan as a leader in a certain way, and he evolved to a completely different feeling about it. But that's a very astute point. In general, Matt is very comfortable with dancing without his clothes on. It's not a problem for him.
So do you think there was a little bit of divided loyalty maybe going on there? Because
Very smart, Susan Lacy. Yeah. Which way the company was, yeah. But, when you talk about trying to remain objective and neutral, they really fought for that. The dancers fought to, it's like you serve the work, you serve the piece. And their commitment was to making that a work of art, what they could bring to it. And with all of that dysfunctional family stuff going on, they would try this, then they would try that, they would do it the other way, that, you know, and they would hold on to the bits that they knew were really true to what they were trying to do and bring them back
Yeah.
as they worked.
They're real heroes here.
Yeah.
Anybody else have any questions? Well, thank you, Mirra. That is an amazing
Thank
work
you,
of art.
Susan. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you all. You're terrific.
I think everybody should see this film.